Well, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the Meir Center. I'm Jerry Hudson, an affiliate here at the center, and we're here to listen to a presentation by Dr. Meir Elran, and it's called The Israeli Power Paradox. And it will be very interesting, I think, for all of us to hear about that. Meir Elran is a visiting scholar at the University of Chicago this year. Normally, he hangs his hat at the Institute for
National Security
Studies in Tel Aviv. He has his PhD from the University of Tel Aviv and has done significant research in the area of social resilience after catastrophes. Being Israeli, you might imagine that that would mean mostly terrorism, and it is. They have a very large database on that. But he's now working on a paper about resilience after cyber attack, which I think could certainly well apply to this country as well. We'll see what happens in November. On a personal note, I'd like to tell you that Meir and I have known each other for 50 years, even though I know that you think that by our age, I mean, how on earth could we ever know anybody that long by the way we look, but in fact it's true. But with that, I'd like to introduce Meir, if we could give him a nice Meir welcome.
So, good afternoon, everybody. It's great to be here. Thanks a lot for such a nice crowd. I mean, I think it's indicative of how people in this university, and especially in the Meir Center, are interested in international relations and affairs, and perhaps also in what's going on in the Middle East and in Israel. So I want to thank the organizers for inviting me over here. And especially I would like to thank, of course, my very good friend, Professor George Hudson. When we were back, actually we started our friendship, long-standing friendship back in the 60s, late 60s, when we were both graduate students with Indiana University in Wilmington, Indiana. And our respective spheres of interest were Soviet studies. So Jerry was persistent enough to stick to the Russian stuff for so many years, and that's why he is such a great scholar and has a great reputation of being a Russian expert. I, because of different reasons, when I came back to Israel after my studies, was involved with the Soviet, at the time, affairs in the Middle East, back in the 70s. But then, interestingly enough, they disappeared from the scene because of different reasons. And then, of course, the collapse of the Soviet Empire took place, and Russia replaced it. And now, all of a sudden, without my covering this subject, Russia came back to the Middle East in a manner that resembles, to a large extent, what was happening with the Soviet Union back, 40 or 50 years ago. It's very interesting when you think about what Russia is doing presently in so many ways in the Middle East and elsewhere. I think it really is important to remember that some of the basic interests and also the conduct of the Russians that we were familiar with at the time repeat themselves presently. So I think it's interesting to see the similarities and perhaps also the differences. So as Jerry said, I'm most of the time engaged with my studies with the INSS. This is the Institute for National Security Council studies with the Tel Aviv University, and what I'm trying mostly to do is to deal with the domestic security issues emanating from the domestic situation in Israel, whereas the other people in my institute are dealing mostly with the external threats. That's what brings me to this issue of resilience, or societal resilience, as Jerry was talking about. I'm saying that because my presentation today is mostly about the external issues that are characteristics of the situation, the security situation of Israel. But after I'm, sharing with you my thoughts about this so-called paradox of the Israeli security situation, I will be open to questions on whatever you want to ask me. I'm not sure I'll be able to answer all your questions, of course, but I'll try to do that, so we don't have to necessarily limit ourselves to what I'm going to talk about, because I think we have until about 5 o'clock, if you bear with me, and I'll be somewhat brief in my presentation to allow more time for questions and comments if you have. Okay, I understand that everybody can hear me well, no problem with that? Thank you very much. Okay, so my presentation today will focus on an intriguing strategic question, which has both theoretical and practical bearings. Specifically, I shall try to explain how it is that a country that is clearly the strongest power in the Middle East, militarily and otherwise, is facing difficulties to coerce its much weaker adversaries. I believe that addressing this question will shed light on the role of strategic thinking in managing ongoing conflicts and responding to security threats in general and in the Middle East in particular. So let me start with some background notes. The 70th anniversary of the State of Israel, which is happening this year, is a good opportunity to present a balance sheet of strengths and weaknesses concerning the continuous security challenges to the State of Israel. Let me suggest that the security issue is still, to a large extent, after such a long time and numerous wars between Israel and its neighbors, it is still very high on the national agenda and the primary benchmark for Israelis to gauge their overall strategic position. Let me begin by presenting 8 strategic components of strengths that characterize the State of Israel to my understanding. Generally, I want to say that it's interesting, and I think that our Prime Minister, Netanyahu, was right in suggesting that, and I quote, "our situation was never so good," end of quote. Now, actually, my presentation here is in agreement, basically, with what he says, but at the same time, I would like to raise some questions to what extent is it truly the case. So I hope that after I conclude my remarks, you'll have a more qualified understanding of this statement of the Prime Minister. So 8 components of strengths. Number 1, Israel is definitely the strongest regional power in many aspects, clearly in comparison with its neighbors, each by itself, and also in an unlikely event of hostile coalition, apart from perhaps Iran and Turkey, which are not Arab countries. So Israel is really, by itself and relatively to its neighbors, a very strong and powerful country in many ways. The second one is that Israel is the only democracy in the Middle East. Not only just a democracy, but a very viable, active, and open democracy. It has been successful in sustaining its democratic values and practices despite external, and I might add mostly internal, continuous challenges. The third one is that Israel has been a stable and prosperous economy by most accounts. The most significant recent development has been its becoming a regional energy supplier of natural gas, and interestingly enough, also to its neighbors, to its Arab neighbors, Jordan and Egypt. And we're talking about deals that are in billions of dollars on an annual basis. The fourth one is that Israel enjoys long-standing special relations with the United States, manifested in strategic, economic, diplomatic, and other domains, and also in society to society, and presently also to a large extent in the leader-to-leader intimate ties. This is very important by itself. The fifth one is that Israel has acquired unprecedented international prominence and diplomatic and economic relations overall. Just to mention the EU, Germany, Russia, China, India, some of which are countries that not too long ago were quite hostile to the State of Israel and did not have any kind of real political and diplomatic relations with our country. But I want to say that with all due respect to the very good relations that we have with so many countries, some of them still have diplomatic reservations and hindrances about our policies. The sixth one is that Israel has achieved, albeit continuous, popular, prevalent hostility, a formidable regional status. It maintains the stable peace with Egypt, already 40 years of peace with Egypt, the most important country in the Arab world, and also with Jordan, with which we have very, very close security collaboration. Also, we have a very strong and significant security cooperation with the Palestinian Authority. Not too many people know about that, but this is a very defining fact with regard to our problematic relations with the Palestinians in general and with the Palestinian Authority in particular. Israel also enjoys a growing pragmatic cooperation with other Arab countries, mostly known as the more moderate, pragmatic Arab countries like Saudi Arabia, the Gulf states, and Morocco. These are things that were not thought of as possible not too many years ago. The seventh one would be that Israel's main foes in the area, Iran, Syria, and then Hezbollah and Hamas, are basically, generally, weak and politically isolated, which of course adds to the overall picture as far as our strategic situation is concerned. And the eighth and lastly, the Palestinian issue is generally backstaged, which is seen by many Israelis and also by the Israeli government as advantageous. Of course, some people can see it in different manners, but the fact of the matter is that Israel finds it quite comfortable to have the Palestinian issue not in the forefront of its overall international and strategic situation. Now, I want to stress, please, that each of these components of Israeli strength can rapidly be changed, and also for the worse. This obliges Israel to be aware, diligent, and continue to invest in sustaining its strategic achievements as much as it is up to her. And unfortunately, it's not always up to us to see to it that our overall situation sustain itself for the better. Now, at the same time, there are also components of weaknesses and challenges, and I would like to speak about three of the prominent ones. The first one is the situation with Iran. So Iran is indeed posing growing strategic risk to the State of Israel and its basic interests. Even if one does not subscribe, as I do not subscribe, to the notion that its posture, the Iranian posture, represents a real, what people call existential threat to the country, as suggested, for example, by our Prime Minister. Still, the Shiite revolutionary state does challenge Israel seriously so and actively so by several important processes. The first, of course, is the nuclear issue, which has now returned to the forefront following the U.S. recent decision to withdraw from the so-called JCPOA. This is the agreement between Iran and the 5+1 international community representatives. The second thing with regard to the Iranian challenge is its energetic drive for what we call regional hegemony, which is manifested by their active support to our immediate adversaries, mostly Hezbollah, and this is done through mostly the supply of sophisticated guided missiles, as well as by their support for international and regional terrorism. So this is the second Iranian issue that we are concerned with. The third one, which is more immediate and perhaps more threatening to us in the short run, is the Iranians' growing military presence in Syria, mostly, by the way, implemented through the so-called Revolutionary Guard, which is another parallel military system of the Iranian state. The problem for us is that this poses Iran, instead of being remote or distant from the borders of Israel, to be a power that is actually present with its own forces or its mercenaries in direct proximity to the border of the state of Israel, near the so-called Golan Heights in our northern flanks. And we are trying, of course, to distance them from the border, but right now they are present in the vicinity of, let's say, about 100 kilometers from our border. And the fourth thing, as a consequence of all that, we see that there is a direct and active military challenge, I would even say provocation, on the part of the Iranians by trying to challenge the sovereignty of Israel's territory and probing, I would say, our resolve as far as their presence in Syria, as I said, in direct proximity to the country is concerned. So this is, in short, encapsulates the Iranian threat to the state of Israel. And this is only the first major point of challenge as far as we are concerned. Now, the second one is the dynamic situation in Syria. Now, Assad is approaching a stage of victory in his long struggle in the civil war, lasting already for the 8th year, and he has really achieved this victory mostly by active military involvement or support of his external supporters, mainly, by the way, the Russian air presence and air strikes on the different rebels' positions throughout the country. Now, admittedly, Syria by itself is militarily no match to Israel and is basically totally exposed to the Israeli superiority. Still, and it is important to remember that the Syrian weakness, or relatively weakness, presently is significantly compensated by several important elements. The first one is, as I suggested, the Russian robust military presence, both air, naval, advisors, and air defense in Syria, and particularly, as I said, the vast airstrike campaign against the rebels. This poses a potential risk for Israel, despite the deconfliction mechanism with the Israeli Defense Forces, as was evident just last week in the incident of the Syrian shooting down of the Russian reconnaissance plane. Now, the incident by itself, though unfortunate in many ways, is just an indication of the potential risk of Israel having to face in a military manner, a superpower. And that's not a small matter for a country like Israel. They are there, we are there, we're trying to be in contact and to reconcile the differences, etc., etc. But this is a major new challenge for us, which we have to take into consideration. So as I suggested, this introduces a sensitive element, curtailing, in fact, or that might curtail, in fact, the Israeli freedom of air maneuver in Syria, which is so necessary for us in the context of the Iranian Hezbollah domain, mostly with regard to transferring sophisticated weapon systems, mostly guided missiles, from Iran to Hezbollah to be used against Israel. So this is about the Russian compensation for the Syrian weakness. The second one is the Hezbollah's military involvement in fighting. They have thousands of troops located and working in Syria itself, side by side but with the Syrians. But as far as Israel is concerned, their presence there is translated, as far as Israel is concerned, into what we call two-front deployment facing Israel, which is one in Lebanon, which was the traditional front of engagement between Israel and Hezbollah, but now being present on the Syrian front, we have actually either a broader front or a two-front front with Hezbollah in our northern border. So that was Russia, that was Hezbollah, and of course the third one is the Iranian growing regular military presence that includes thousands of Shiite mercenaries, and I spoke about that earlier already. So hence, despite the Syrian weakness, the more than 7 years of civil war has shaped its landscape as highly destabilized, open to foreign military intervention, and by and large a major theater of threat for Israel on its northern flank. And I think that the complexity of the situation in Syria presently and possibly also in the foreseeable future is a very dangerous thing for the interest of the State of Israel. So this was the second major point of challenge for Israel. Now the third one is the third strategic challenge is represented by the Palestinian issue. So beforehand, I put the Palestinian issue, the fact that it is backstage, I put it as an advantage. But at the same time, it's imperative for me to put it also in the weakness part. This is at least my understanding of the situation. So again, I want to say a few words about the Palestinian present situation and very shortly with the highlights. I want to suggest to you that the political extended lull, which some would perceive as a positive development, pose serious danger in the longer run. Now we're talking about already about 4 or 5 years in which practically there is no line of communication on the diplomatic or political level between us and the Palestinians. Okay? Contrary to what has been the situation off and on, not very fruitful, but still we had an ongoing dialogue with the Palestinians on future possible peace or arrangement or any kind of other political process. Since the so-called Kerry initiative, which was unfortunately ended, okay, we do not have any meaningful, some indirect talks of course, yes, but not really any kind of meaningful process of trying to promote any kind of solution to the Palestinian problem. Now the prospects for the introduction of the Trump so-called Great Deal, whatever it means and whatever it generates, might also turn into a renewed challenge for Israel. And this is something that we are quite concerned about, or some of us are quite concerned about in Israel. Right now everything looks beautiful with the relations with the administration here, but there is a prospect, I would say, that if and when the deal or the structure of the deal or the content of the deal will be exposed and delivered to the parties, I think that there are enough indications to show that it will be a major challenge, at least for the Israeli government, as far as we understand its policies and inclinations as far as the Palestinians are concerned. So this is one thing, the status of the negotiations. The second element with regard to the Palestinian problem for Israel is what happens in the post-Abu Mazen era. Now this Abu Mazen, this person who is the leader of the Palestinian Authority, he is the president of the PA, he is not a very young person and he is not a very healthy person. So, who knows what will happen after he is gone. We wish him all the best for many years, but, everything comes to an end. And the point is that the post-Abu Mazen era raises huge uncertainties. We don't have a clue as to the forthcoming leadership, its orientation, fate, and one can foresee that instability and lack of hopeful vision in the Palestinian camp might raise severe risks for Israel. Now, I just want to add that unfortunately, the democratic system of the Palestinian Authority is not really the strongest. It's not a model for freedom or whatever, equality and rights, etc., etc. And one of the problems is that since the last election, years have passed beyond what they need as far as their own system, and no elections are being held. If elections are held, there is a chance, I would say a strong chance, that the Fatah, which is the more moderate, and stronger Palestinian party or alignment of parties, will lose to the Hamas, which is the more extreme one. And this, of course, will change the political situation dramatically. And this is something that we have to take into consideration. So without leadership, with uncertainty about the future, I think it's a major challenge for us. And then, of course, the last one is the Hamas immediate challenge based on its ideology, extreme religious Sunni fundamentalism, coupled with adamant anti-Israeli stance, and coupled with socio-economic and humanitarian chaos in the Gaza Strip. At the same time, they continue to build up militarily, mostly again by missiles, offensive and defensive tunnels, and other fortifications. And there is a suggestion that the Gaza is on the threshold of explosion, mostly because of the humanitarian situation there. And it's true, I think, and many people allude to that in Israel, that the economic and social situation in this strip is practically impossible. And if nothing is done seriously for the long run in this area, it will be very bad for them, but also not very good for us. So this is really a major issue that has to be contended with. So this was my sort of basic background for the discussion, which I wanted to share with you about the main subject of my presentation. This is the Israeli security paradox. So as I propose, Israel is stronger than ever. However, it finds it difficult to translate its robust military advantage to tangible gains when facing its active adversaries. So this is the essence of the argument that I'm putting forth here. We are very strong, but we do not have the capacity to translate our strength to stand up to our visions or our basic interests, at least in some very important elements which I'm going to allude to now. So Israel, on one hand, continues to invest huge expenditures, about 6% of its GDP, plus over $3 billion annually, given to us by the American taxpayer, in its military buildup. This is huge amount of money. When I talk about 6%, you have to understand that normal countries, like in Europe in America and other places spend between 1.5 to 2.5, sometimes 3% of their GDP. So we are actually investing double the amount of the GDP in Israel on security, plus we are being supported heavily since the 1970s, and again for the next 10 years at least, by a very generous and significant American military financed support from the US. So what we do with that huge amount of money is we are enhancing our military buildup, mostly our offensive systems, mainly in the Air Force, because of its flexibility and capacity to operate in diverse and changing scenes. Recently, more is allocated to defensive systems, mostly for the active air defense, like this famous Iron Dome, which is a very sophisticated system developed in Israel together with American expertise against the so-called high trajectory weapon systems. This is the nice word for rockets and missiles and mortars. I mean, everything that flies above and come to you from an unexpected angle. Beyond its offensive buildup and actual military continuous conduct, in what is referred to Israel as the campaign between wars, deterrence is perceived as the key to Israel's strategic response to its immediate strategic and security challenges. Now, I want to say something about this term, campaigns between wars. Since we understand that the regular, large-scale wars are happening in a slower sequence, gladly, still we find ourselves again and again engaged with smaller wars, which we call campaign, just to differentiate between the big ones and the smaller ones. The fact of the matter is that Israel is being engaged and active almost daily, militarily, to defend its border and to answer its different interests, as I have alluded to before, and I'll say a few words about later. In this context, that we are always waiting for the next campaign or the next war, okay, deterrence, the issue or the notion of deterrence is very, very important in our military doctrine and military practices, okay? So the idea is that, and this has been traditionally accepted in Israel as a major concern, we need to build our deterrence, which is designed to create longer pauses between the perceived unavoidable repeated rounds of war. So the idea is that we are still facing a situation in which another round is imminent. What we try to do by deterrence mostly is to enhance the time span between the wars. This has been the concept that was designed already by David Ben-Gurion back in the early 50s, when we were in a situation that we had those wars, those repeated wars between us and the other nation states of our neighbors. And now it has been replaced to the non-state adversaries that we have. But basically it's the same idea. We want to have longer pauses, and this is where the issue of deterrence stands. However, the present problem for us is that the deterrence concept has quite interesting and important challenges for us. The first one is that deterrence, also in the literature of security in the international arena, is commonly basically a temporary trait with an inherent expiration date. Okay? You don't know what happens tomorrow. As long as war or another eruption of military conflict starts, you think that you are under a situation of deterrence. And then, all of a sudden, you find yourself in another war, and the deterrence has expired without you knowing about that in advance. This is one element. The second one is the deterrence is found to be less effective when applied against non-state entities, like Hezbollah and like Hamas. Furthermore, deterrence is commonly less sustainable in situations of abrupt deterioration, as was the case in the last major conflicts which we had with Hezbollah in 2006 and with Hamas in 2014. But beyond all that, Israel has found itself being in fact deterred itself by Hezbollah and Hamas, who have both acquired significant high-trajectory weapon system capabilities to severely threaten the Israeli civilian home front. This has created a de facto mutual deterrence uneven balance, which significantly limits the Israeli military superiority and grants its adversaries with some advantage because they have less to lose, or at least we think that they have less to lose in case of a confrontation. So this is really an important issue for us, that from being a one-sided deterrence provider for our own security, we found ourselves in a situation where there is a sort of a mutual, as I said, uneven kind of a deterrence. Because as much, or almost as much as we can deter them, they actually also can and do also deter us. And this is very important in the present circumstances. So consequently, we face the profound paradox that the two non-state, basically inferior entities, Hezbollah and Hamas, are ironically perceived and publicly acknowledged by the IDF as the most serious adversaries of the State of Israel. I said that this is ironic because basically we had to understand that if you just compare the data about the Israeli military force and the Hezbollah and furthermore the Hamas military capacities, there is no way to compare. They don't have an air force, they don't have navies, they don't have the capacities, the numbers are much inferior, etc., etc. But the fact of the matter is that when you look at the documents published by the IDF, including the last two documents provided publicly by the Chief of Staff of the Israeli Defense Forces, Hezbollah mostly and also Hamas are recognized, acknowledged as the number one military issue for the State of Israel. This by itself says something about the perception and the meaning of perception as far as how we in Israel see our own situation versus our inferior adversaries. Now this is not just a theoretical proposition. The historical fact is that mighty Israel could not reach a military victory against Hezbollah in 2006 in 33 days of fighting in Lebanon. 33 days. Now I just want to remind you that the 6 days war was fought for 6 days, as you can imagine. The Yom Kippur War, which started with the strategic surprise in a very, very bad situation for the State of Israel, lasted 16 days. And now we're talking about, this was, both wars were against, huge militaries, divisions, Air Force, Navy, etc., etc. And now we're talking about Hezbollah, with all due respect, as I said, inferior. 33 days. And even then, and we think that it was a victory, but the victory was not really a great victory. As we say, it was not a decisive victory. Same thing happened with the more inferior adversary, Hamas, in 2014, and this time it took 51 days. 51 days in which Hamas was able to launch on an average 120 rockets against civilian targets in Israel, and we could not actually decide this conflict. We could not do that because of a variety of reasons. Most of them, by the way, are not strictly military. Diplomatic, international, politics, in Israel, Arab world, etc., etc. But the fact of the matter is that in 51 days, all we managed was to retain the status quo, which was not too bad at the time, but it shows you what I'm talking about when I speak about this paradox. At the same time, admittedly, we have to remind ourselves that since those two conflicts, Israel enjoys 12 years of periodical disrupted stability facing Hezbollah. Okay? So deterrence over there still prevails. And also 4 years of fragile non-war with Hamas. Off and on, all kind of different disruptions, but basically no war, which is good enough. So the picture is far from being one-dimensional, as one can expect. So I was talking about the build-up, I was talking about deterrence, and I want to talk about the third element in the Israeli strategic concept, and this is the offensive capabilities. Now here again, when we talk about the offensive capabilities, one should realize the complexity of the implementation of what we talk about when we speak about the offensive capability. On the face of it, as I said again and again, Israel enjoys clear superiority over its two immediate foes. However, translating this superiority into the needed strategic achievement, the IDF has to massively deploy its ground forces with so-called boots on the ground. An attempt to conquer enemy populated territory, which is needed for achieving such a decisive victory, is expected to be very costly. Israel is reluctant to pay the high price, particularly as it is skeptical whether hard military pressure can bring a meaningful change in its adversaries' policies. Furthermore, Israel doubts, and rightfully so, it doubts the strategic benefit of bringing about the collapse of the current regimes of Hamas and Hezbollah. Both are surely considered to be ardent, ideologically driven enemies of Israel. However, if they disappear from the scene, they might possibly be replaced by unwarranted chaos and perhaps by more extreme political systems. As has been the case with the Israeli approach towards the Syrian regime of Bashar al-Assad, the saying goes in Israel, my present known foe is better than the unknown replacement. And another reason for Israel's reluctance to apply full-scale military pressure during war against its lesser contenders is related to the risks to its own civilian front. As I suggested before, it is the case because of the growing effectiveness of the upgraded standoff capabilities of Hezbollah and to a lesser account, Hamas. This risk stands behind the Israeli continuous thwarting efforts to deny its adversaries the game-changing weapon systems, mainly precise guided missiles that can inflict severe damage in terms of fatalities and infrastructure for the civilian front in Israel. A large-scale damage to the civilian Israeli front might be unacceptable in terms of domestic political cost to the government, particularly as the strategic gains to be achieved are not necessarily very promising. So under these circumstances, it would be safe to characterize, at least that's what I'm suggesting to you, that Israel is basically a status quo power, namely one that is interested in preserving the present strategic setting with all its security impediments. It might be interesting to clarify that the defense establishment in Israel mainly the IDF and the Ministry of Defense and the other organizations around them, they're all strongly advocating cautious policies versus Hezbollah and Hamas, granting the government the sobering rationalization in face of the right-wing extreme demands for straightforward military adventures. Still, in spite of these rational calculations and the sustained deterrence, as I suggested, of Israel, that Israel enjoys, there is no guarantee that the situation will not explode abruptly in a possible scenario of unexpected and undesired military deterioration. In fact, this is definitely the more likely scenario, to my understanding, in the two major fronts of Israel. And I conclude by referring to the two fronts in the present and foreseeable future. In the northern front, as I have discussed before, the Iranians are currently representing the more immediate challenge, when they and Israel seem to be determined to maximize their conflicting interests. This is not only a local issue of establishing an Iranian military base or presence in Syria and providing advanced weaponry to Hezbollah. It is also the broader issue related to the strategic struggle between Israel and Iran, with the nuclear issue in its center. The stakes here are very high, and without a mature adult, and with Russia playing a vital role, and the U.S. not interested really, the chances for deterioration and unwarranted confrontation are considerable. And in the southern front, the stakes are perhaps lesser, but the odds for deterioration are higher. The chaotic situation in Gaza is rapidly worsening. The provocations by Hamas are becoming repugnant, and the chances for a sustainable political arrangement facilitated by Egypt are not promising. This unfortunate situation might serve as a background to yet another open confrontation, the fourth of its kind since Hamas took over Gaza in 2006. Now, in summary, the Israeli security paradox can be defined in one sentence. And here is my suggestion. Despite of its military might and its strategic superiority, Israel as a status quo power, which has no interest in another confrontation and which holds a significant deterrence capacity, is still facing a continuous perilous situation that a new war might erupt within the next 2 days. It can be alert, it can be cautious, but its strength is not sufficient to guarantee what it needs most: a stable environment. It has to keep up living on its sword. And it did, as it did in the last 70 years. Thank you very much.
Thanks to Dr. Meir Elran very much for that stimulating presentation. I forgot to add when I introduced him to you one of the major marks in his long and illustrious career, which is that he retired as a general in the Israeli army and also as deputy director of Israeli military intelligence. So he knows of what he speaks here. And I'll open things up for questions. Pete?
General, thanks for your comments and for coming today. Back in another lifetime, I was executive officer to General David Petraeus during the surge in Iraq. And right after that, we were invited, not him, but I was and a few others, to Israel in late 2008. They wanted to pick our brains on what had worked in the surge. And what I basically told them is you need willing partners within the civilian community on the other side, as we were able to gain with the awakening movement. And that when you find those willing partners, you need to leverage them, and that they can help, you can separate the reconcilables from the irreconcilables. And what I got back was basically, we don't believe there are any reconcilables in the Palestinian community. And one to deal with. And they were much more interested in sort of the tactical issues of the battlefield, of the counterinsurgency battlefield, and completely ignored the larger strategic lesson of the surge. I'm just wondering what your thoughts are on the possibility of actually finding willing partners in the Palestinian community to make a lasting peace. And if you had that, obviously deterrence, you wouldn't need deterrence.
How shall we do it? One by one, or shall we?
Yeah, we'll do it.
Okay. That's. I mean, this is a question. Thank you very much for it. That we can spend the next 35 minutes on easily, and not come to a real, comprehension of the complex situation. So let me put it this way. First of all, I really appreciate your question and also your service, and mostly with David Petraeus, who is, as a matter of fact, a great friend, not only of Israel but also of the INSS. As a matter of fact, Petraeus is a permanent member of our annual international conference that we hold. So since actually he left the government, he's coming every year to share with us his thoughts about the global situation, and also about the situation in the Middle East, and we always are very, very, impressed with what he has to say based on his, wide experience and wisdom. So let me put it this way. I think that you're absolutely right in two accounts. Number one, you're right in theoretical, conceptual account, and you're also right in terms of the potential here. In other words, I think that in reality, it's not just a conceptual matter, but also in reality, the search for willing partners or allies or facilitators of whatever is a major leverage, I think, for any kind of progress. Now, the truth of the matter is that we have to face reality, but I would add reality on both sides. But I'll start with the Arab side and with the Palestinian side. It is very, very difficult. It's not impossible, but it's very, very difficult to find people who would be willing, interested, and capable to work with us. Tactically, as I said, and it's very important, we have a very important security cooperation with the PA, with the armed forces. I mean, it's not a military, but, that the U.S., by the way, has actually established, trained, financed, and what have you. I think Americans are still active over there in terms of, enhancing the capacity of the security forces of the PA. So in this respect, we have willing partners, but they are very limited to one context, which is important for us, but it does not enable us to broaden the spectrum. What they are willing to do and able to do and are doing in this respect are helping us a lot, and themselves, is versus the Hamas in the West Bank. When it comes to their entanglement or their, situation with the Hamas or the Hamas strongholds or networks, what have you, in the West Bank, they are doing what they need to do together with us to get rid of them. And most of the arrests and the, actions against Hamas in the West Bank are being implemented by the Palestinians themselves, by the PA, which is great for us. So we have them in this kind of a context. But beyond that, they're not willing, let's say. I think that they might be capable, but they're not really willing. So, and I think that it's not only there, it's not only in the Palestinian camp, but it's also, important in the Arab world. When it comes to their own interests, like the situation in Jordan and the situation in Egypt, look, we have to admit that the military, we have this peace with Egypt for more than 40 years now. And only in the last 2 years, as a matter of fact, 3 years, since President Sisi came to power in Egypt, okay, our relations were very, very thin, okay, not really meaningful, which was, peace by itself, the fact that we didn't have war was huge, but in terms of not doing something together was not good enough. Still, by the way, in Egypt and in Jordan, by the way, we do not have any society-to-society relations, nothing, okay, on the contrary. The Arabs in Egypt and in Jordan and in other countries are still hostile to Israel. But the military and the government are playing very, very close relations with us on security issues. So again, when they need it, we can do it, and we do it. So this is as far as the Arab side, Palestinian or otherwise. But I want to add to that there is also the Israeli aspect. And the Israeli aspect is influenced by the way Israelis in general, and our government in particular, the way we look at the Palestinians. And there is a huge element here to be remembered, that still today, and I would say even more so today, and mostly after the Second Intifada of 2000 to 2004, which was sort of a break in the system that we were trying together with them to build between us, this whole thing collapsed. And now it's mostly separation, and mostly, for Israelis, mostly separation, and mostly hostility, animosity, and, represented or manifested by the fact that we are very happy, or the Israeli government is very happy with the fact that there is no political movement forward. So we also have our own share, Israelis have also our own share in this unfortunate situation that we are lacking, or we don't have those who will be able to work together with us to gain some progress in the Palestinian issue. This is a very, very dire situation to my understanding. I would be very, very glad if things could move forward, but they have to move forward with the willingness of the two sides. And presently, there is no willingness on the part of the two sides to make any meaningful progress, each because of its own interests or perceived interests.
John?
Yeah, my question actually follows on that. Why is this condition there? If you were around in 1948 and asked people if Israel created, is there going to be trouble? They would say yes, and you're right. And then you say, how long is the trouble going to last? And they'd say, well, 10 years, 15 years. If you said 70 going on 700, they'd be appalled. So the question is, why don't the Muslims, it's not just Arabs obviously, give up? 70 years of failure would suggest that maybe you're not doing the right thing. And there simply isn't any movement in that direction. It just keeps festering. Serbia accepts Kosovo being, and a whole bunch of other things going right. Germany accepted defeat. Japan accepted defeat. And they just keep perpetuating it. Why do they keep hating Israel?
Well, really great question. Let me try to answer that. I mean, I'm not sure I'm able to, to grasp the entire story here. First of all, it took the Arab nations, countries, okay, like Egypt, mostly Egypt and the others, until 1973 to realize that they actually are in the losing end militarily. And that was the great thing about the 1973 war, basically, that it produced the peace with Egypt, which is really, I think, the number one strategic achievement of the State of Israel in its 70 years of history. So this really is a very important thing. So this is as far as the Arab...
Still 25 years. It's still a long time.
Well, I am willing to wait, if permitted, 25 extra years for a normalization and reconciliation with the Palestinians, okay? We have to take our time. That's not the problem. It is a problem, but it's not the problem. Timing. The problem now is that we're talking about, there is this process of radicalization in the Middle East, okay? There is no doubt about it. Nation states are less important, and the other, entities or movements or whatever you want, be it Muslim religious fundamental ones or whatever, okay, ethnic groups, etc., become more important. In these sectors or in these circumstances, the hostility against Israel can be nourished, in a better way. At the same time, I want to suggest that in some instances, I think that there is a growing realization in the Arab world that Israel is here to stay, and that they should, one way or another, come into terms with it because of two reasons. One is the strength of Israel and the fact that 70 years have already elapsed, so, I mean, as you suggested. But the second thing is Iran, because for many of them, especially the more moderate countries, they understand that basically, at least in the immediate or in the foreseeable future, Iran is their major issue. And the enemy of my enemy is my friend. If not friend, at least it is my collaborator, if you wish. So there are things happening. Again, it takes two to tango. And let me just say here that then, I mean, we would love to have working relations with the Saudis. That would be really great and compatible with our interests and also compatible with the logic. But the fact of the matter is that the government of Israel, unfortunately again, or the governments of Israel since 2002, when the so-called Saudi political initiative, which later on became the Arab political initiative, for having some kind of a peace with Israel, was basically rejected. By the way, not officially rejected, but was not accepted, let's say, by the Israeli governments since its initiation. Just think about the fact, and this is, I think, going to be the case if there is progress here. There will not be any kind of progress as far as our relations with the Arab moderate countries if we do not do something or are willing to negotiate in good faith on the fate of the Palestinian people, as requested or demanded by the Arab Initiative. So it's not just a one-sided picture. It's, at least two-folded. And I think that we have to understand where our interests lie. And there is a major controversy in Israel about this question. What serves us best? And the people, parties, and forces within Israel that think that peace is nice but not crucial, but strength and territory is crucial, those people are gaining grounds. This is a fact, whether some people like it or not. And some people would say that it is, better than others, but this is the crux of the argument that goes on in Israel presently. So what I'm saying is that there are many sides to the problem, many ways to solve it. I think that there are ways to solve it, but it takes two.
Chris?
So thank you very much for your talk. I wanted to ask your reaction to this sense of the Israeli dilemma that you're talking about, because it seems to me a lot of this dilemma really comes from the fact that Israel as a state is interacting with security problems from groups who are not states, and then that creates all kinds of problems in terms of the legal status of Israeli military actions in Gaza and so on. That creates problems for international law. And wouldn't Israel just be better off? Wouldn't the thing that would make Israel more secure and more able to exercise its power to be interacting with other states and to make sure that the territories of Gaza and the Palestinian Authority became states? Because then the kinds of provocations that we see coming from Gaza, if Gaza was a state, then that would not, Israeli responses would not be viewed as disproportionate or illegal or anything like that.
Yeah.
And part of the reason that you can't get it, those areas to be states is because you keep talking about it takes two to tango and we need a party on the other side, but you're trying to fit a two-state solution onto a party with onto a problem with three parties. And shouldn't we really be looking for a three-state solution? One state in Gaza, one on the West Bank, and then Israel. And it seems to me Israel could do this either by starting to negotiate with Hamas about becoming a state in Gaza. That's going to put pressure on the PA to want to make deals that they're currently not willing to make because they would potentially lose status as the representative of the Palestinian people. Or absent any kind of deal with them, simply withdraw from the West Bank, go behind the wall and say, fine, we're done. Y'all have control of the territory, you're a state, and why you don't need a partner? You've got a wall.
Okay, so thanks, Chris, for this one again.
Just trying to be helpful.
Thank you for that.
We're going to solve this problem.
Well, I think, basically, again, I mean, I have to admit, you could have, I mean, I'm not hiding it. I have some other opinions than my government. And, I mean, who knows who is right? Okay, maybe my government is right and I'm wrong, etc. So let me start by suggesting that with all due respect to what's happening now on the fence in Gaza, the only significance of that, apart from the fact that people are being killed, this is, of course, a tragedy by itself, but strategically, is not really important because it doesn't really change much. It's just, different kinds of noises in the overall, domain. And also the issue of our, international standing as far as, international relations, the UN, the BDS, etc., with all due respect again, noises, basically. So I'm not really impressed with this one, personally. I'm much more impressed with the real central issue behind this question of yours. And it's not just Gaza. It's, again, our relations with the Palestinians. And I am, for one, in total agreement with those, and you apparently this is also your perspective of the situation. I think really that it's time for us, after 70 years, which is actually much more than 70 years, started all the way back after the First World War, when we first made ourselves to be really a nation in the Holy Land. So what will be the outcome of the fact? And it is a fact now. I mean, nobody now says, like Golda Meir said, that there was nothing like the Palestinians are not really, they don't constitute a nation. They're not a nation. Okay, now everybody understands and recognizes, not everybody, but it's understood that they are a nation. And furthermore, that they are entitled to their own place. Now, really, the question is not that. The question presently is, what will be the shape of this statehood of the Palestinian state? What will be the shape of it? And to what extent this, what Bibi Netanyahu calls state minus for the Palestinians, what will be the process for its enactment? And to what extent we have to make any decisions right now, okay? I was sitting today with some friends here from the Mashon Center. We were talking about the strategic decision-making process in the State of Israel. And I suggested to them that perhaps the best way for Israelis to make decisions is to postpone the decision. So we have an issue. We have a clue about the future, okay? We understand for our own reasons, domestic reasons, that we don't want to have a one state because it's contrary to our interest as a Jewish nation that wants to sustain itself democratically. But because of political considerations and because of different kinds of, mostly because of domestic political consideration, and because of other things, we don't think that that's the right time to make those major decisions. And that's why we postpone this whole thing, this whole process. When it comes to, when the chips are down, that's why I was alluding beforehand to the Trump Great Deal, okay? Who knows? I mean, you never know. I don't know what can happen with this administration. Maybe somebody here knows. But I'm watching television together with Jerry, and we're trying to figure it out, and so far we did not come up with anything viable. So, but thinking about it, just think about it. I mean, this is a very interesting situation in which an American president, which is very supportive of the Israeli government, very supportive, when he comes, or his son-in-law, whoever, when the Americans come with a plan, it would be very, very difficult for this government of Israel to exercise its postponing tactics. It was easier with Obama. It was easier with Clinton. It was easier with Bush. With Trump, I would be hesitant, you know. So I don't know exactly. I can't tell you what happens, but this is mostly about the timing and the process. It's not about the essence, because if you talk about the essence, I think that everybody understands that basically, at least the starting point is the Clinton plan of 2000, okay, which is basically 2 states, one viable and one less so, okay? Okay, and how less and how more, this will be somewhat negotiated. So that's why I said beforehand, for example, it's very important what happens after Abu Mazen, because who actually is the one that's going to take the lead on these negotiations. Right now, forget it. But in the future, if you have a different kinds of leadership in the Palestinian nation, I mean, the Hamas is able to present itself as a third country between the river and the sea, mostly because of the weakness of Abu Mazen and Fatah. Not so. That's my interpretation of the situation, okay? And if there is another kind of leadership, which will be hopefully emerging from, in the Palestinian camp later on, perhaps. So that would be my attempted proposal for this one.
Let's see, on this side of the room. Yes, sir.
Thank you very much for your comment. Really quite a bit. I've been to a lot of lectures regarding the conflict between Palestinian and Israeli, and I'm always fascinated by the fact that I feel the elephant in the room never gets addressed. And I'd love to pick your brain about this. The idea that, being fair-minded, looking at the whole scenario, looking at that, we have a Palestinian population who used to live there, and over World War II and tragedies that happened toward the Jewish population during World War II and before that, we have to now displace millions of people, create a land to provide shelter for people who rightly need it so, but by doing that, create a vision that even though a lot of times are sugar-coated into democracy and freedom, but in the front line is really seen as a tyrannical regime, as a country that closes water to the rest of the people who are living there, a lot of children death, a lot of excessive force use, and I'm sure you're aware of it. Again, I'm not criticizing people involved with it, but to me it's the elephant in the room, the fact that there is so much of this going on, and yet we're closing our eyes to a lot of that, and we're hoping that the couple million people bring them down to a level of animals. If they're dying, they need to be moved. They move. They're second citizens in Israel, and I hope you attest to that too. Their villages are simply eradicated. How about do you feel there is a problem with that vision that is so one-sided, that totally eradicates one side and then hopes for a meaningful peace and justice? Because if it's only supposed to be one-sided, it's supposed to be billions of dollars from our taxpayer money going to only one side of this conflict, whereas we have children. I'm just reading Columbus, they closed their schools over not having heater in their buildings, and yet billions of dollars are given to the other side of the world, hoping to get peace, and yet it's given to a one-sided vision. What's your thoughts about that? And I hope I'm not being offensive asking that question. I literally just want to pick your brain.
Thank you very much for expressing your opinions. Why picking my brain? Okay, it's absolutely Absolutely acceptable. I don't have any problem with that. Thank you for that. So I don't know exactly who the elephant here is in the room, but I think I understand your question. I think it's a matter of relations or perceptions of the two sides to the way they want to conduct their things. And let me suggest to you that, we have lots of problems with the Arabs, so there's no doubt about that. But just with one remark here. We have three Palestinian groups that are one way or another living within the Israeli system. We have the Israeli citizens, who are the Palestinian Israelis. We have the Palestinians in the West Bank, and we have the Palestinians in Gaza. And you were speaking about the lot, their fate. And one of the things that I'm doing back in Israel is to work on the human or the social aspects, the ones that you raised. And to me, it is quite encouraging that with all the difficulties and with all the challenges and with all the animosity, and there is one, no doubt about it, very basic, between the two sides, I think that Israelis and the Israeli governments have managed to understand that if let's talk about the Palestinians, if Palestinians are willing to live with us, they will fare well. They will be in a good shape. And just let's compare what's happening for the Arabs in Israel, okay, to the Arabs in the West Bank and to unfortunate situation of the chaotic situation of the Palestinians in Gaza. So my suggestion to you is to think about it not only as what Israel is doing, but also what the two things are doing or not doing in order to improve the lot of their own people, of the Palestinian people. Because I think it's a major thing. And unfortunately, look at what's happening, and I say it with pain. What's happening in Gaza under the Hamas regime is appalling. As far as the interest of their own people, okay? And they can make a difference. They can make a difference. And they do not. Because of various reasons that probably can be understood. Not necessarily legitimized, but understood. The situation in the West Bank is much better than the one in Gaza. Much better. In terms of freedom of action, freedom of employment, education, economy, etc., etc. Not that I think that they should satisfy themselves with their situation. They should have better. But compared with the other ones, and compared with what's happening in the other Arab countries, not too bad. And then you think about the Israeli Arabs. Let's say that, again, I would hope for them to be in a better situation economically, socially, in terms of integration, etc., etc. But the movement forward, socially, because of the fact that Israelis understand and know for the fact that the Arabs are basically, in Israel, it's 20% of the population. One of every 5 persons in Israel is an Arab, is a Palestinian. So they are doing very well. Not good enough, not as good as the Israelis, but there are quite a large number of Israelis that fare about the same level as the Arabs. For example, the Haredi community, okay, in terms of their social and economic income, etc., etc. So my point is that indeed there is a problem. There is a humanistic problem here in this equation. It's not only about politics, strategy, security. It's definitely also about people. I agree with you completely. But in order to attend to the needs of the people, I just say the two sides have to do their share. Okay? And having said that, I think it's not a matter of elephant. It's a matter of willingness. And it's practical. And it's doable.
Okay. Yes, sir.
My question is strategic. and it's two parts. Any kind of major change is going to require a bold initiative. My question is, that would include land. At some point, it has to be a land swap. Can the Israeli, from your perspective as a military man, can the Israeli Defense Forces guarantee security for 500,000 Jews who are living on the West Bank? And are the people, not the government of Israel, but are the people of Israel in a position that they would accept such a swap? Do you feel that they're ready for such a move?
There are two questions here. One is a technical, military question of defense of the whatever number of people, Jews remain in the West Bank after the settlement. I don't see 500,000 of them stay there. Okay? I don't think that's an option. But to what extent there is an option for the military to supply the necessary protection to those who do stay, I don't think it's a problem at all. There's no problem. I mean, I'm not saying that it is. I mean, they don't have to provide for them for the protection. Probably they will be needing some kind of a protection. But you know what? The military effort to supply the needed protection to the people presently is huge. I don't know, many people probably don't know that in terms of manpower, military units that are deployed in the West Bank presently, every day, in order to protect these settlements, we're talking about huge, huge expenditures. So the first part of it, the tactical part, is not a problem. The other one, the political part, is the major problem. And so far, as I said before, the political parties on the right, who are mostly representing the settlers or the settlement movement, is strong enough and is not getting weaker. As a matter of fact, it's getting stronger. Not only the party itself, but its role within the ruling party, which is the Likud party, okay, to the extent that they are the ones who are, according to their own philosophy, okay, and beliefs, they are trying to do whatever they can in order to at least postpone any kind of a decision and to make it more difficult when the time comes. And that's what they're doing. Basically, this whole idea of having more and more settlements. By the way, the truth of the matter is that there are no more settlements. There are more people in the same settlements. Because the Israeli government, this is something that is not well known, that the Israeli government is not building new settlements for years now. Okay? And this is not because the government doesn't want to build new settlement. It's because of an American veto. Also, the present government in Washington, okay? And because there was some thoughts amongst some people in Israel that in the Trump era, it's time for us to expand the reaction was quite clear and swift. Because the idea behind it is the actual idea, and then it's not something that is being hidden by the settlers or the settler movement. The idea is to make it impossible, irreversible, for peace to be, for two-state solution to be conducted. Some people say that it's already too late. I don't think that's the case, but I mean, there is an argument here because of the size of the, of this whole thing. But, so this is really the main issue. The main issue is the political issue. And, yeah.
The strategic part, you're saying that would the Israeli army have to protect those settlements, or can they be protected under a Palestinian?
I don't think, listen. Realistically speaking, if there is a presence under Palestinian rule because the question is whether this is going to be the setting. I mean, this is enough different. But if there is a setting in which Israeli communities are under Palestinian sovereignty, I think that, the first choice of everybody, both the Palestinians and the Israelis and the settlers themselves, would be to have an IDF protection.
That's realistic?
It is. Why not? I mean, it's difficult, but the difficulty lies not in the implementation of such a pattern, but getting to it. Once such an arrangement, complicated as it is, because you have to understand, when you look at all the, wherever you look at the map, you see, I mean, just completely complex arrangements. But you know what? Mankind has shown that this is soluble. I mean, I'm not saying that it's easy, but I'm not saying it's impossible. It's possible to do it if there is, how is it, Jerry? If there is a will, there is a will.
Yeah, look at the gerrymandering in the United States. I mean, there's all kinds of possible
Yeah,
geographic.
And we are not too, I mean, Israelis are not too bad in designing all kind of complicated, seemingly impossible structures that work.
Well, it is 5 o'clock, and I promised that, and Meir noted that we do go to 5 o'clock, but that does not preclude your coming up and asking Dr. Elran any questions after the talk is over. But let us thank him again for
Thank you.